the events that would later be known in the local press as the Lost Cradle case began in the winter of 1931 in the small industrial town of Brackford, Pennsylvania, a place where the night smelled of coal ash, where the mill sirens marked the rhythm of daily life, and where the hospital on Merritt Street served as the only sanctuary for mothers, widows, and laborers who had little else except hope for a better beginning for their children. The Brackford Maternity Annex, an aging two-story brick building with narrow halls and dim lamps, had seen its share of tragedy. Premature births, infections, wives widowed by mine accidents, giving birth alone, and children who never took their first breath. In that era, records were kept in pencil. Nurses worked double shifts without complaint, and many decisions were left to quiet judgment rather than precise protocol. On the night of December 3rd, 1931, 2 babies were born within minutes of each other. The first was delivered to Mrs. Margaret Lanning, the young wife of industrialist and local political donor Charles Lanning, a man known throughout Brackford as someone whose donations could build playgrounds or close factories, depending on where his interest lay. The child, a boy, was declared healthy but small. The attending physician noted his low birth weight and recommended observation. The Lannings, who had suffered 2 miscarriages prior, were relieved but fragile, hovering over every medical note with anxious precision. The second infant arrived unexpectedly. Anna Doyle, a widowed miner's wife, whose husband had died in the Caldwell shaft collapse only 6 months earlier, had been brought to the ward by neighbors after collapsing in her modest home. Her delivery was difficult, prolonged, and nearly fatal. The child came into the world silent until Nurse Harrow rubbed his chest with firm, insistent pressure. The boy breathed at last, weakly, but steadily. Anna, pale and exhausted, whispered gratitude between gasps, holding Evelyn's hand. For a moment, the stern nurse softened, brushing a damp tendril of hair from the young woman's face. Later testimony would reveal that this was the moment something inside the veteran nurse shifted, not abruptly, not dramatically, but subtly, like a crack forming in ice. She saw, in the frail widow and her newborn child, the life she once lost and the life she would never have. And in the next room, separated by a thin wall, slept the infant son of a wealthy couple whose influence reached far beyond Brackford's borders. It would be easy, she thought, for a child to grow up unwanted despite privilege, just as it would be easy for a poor child to be drowned by misfortune early on. What happened next was never fully witnessed, only reconstructed. Sometime after midnight, as the ward settled into the muffled quiet of post-delivery fatigue, Evelyn made her rounds. She checked temperatures, adjusted blankets, recorded breathing patterns in the ledger. According to later investigations, she paused longest between the bassinets labeled Lanning and Doyle, illuminated by a faint corridor bulb that flickered now and then, humming unevenly like an old radio. She stood there for several minutes. Other nurses recalled seeing her silhouette through the frosted glass, motionless, as though in contemplation. In the official hospital log, she signed off on both infants' midnight checks with precise handwriting. No tremors, no signs of hesitation. Yet the next morning, the babies that lay in those same bassinets were not the ones recorded in the Night S inventory. The switch had been done so cleanly, so quietly, that even the morning shift nurses failed to notice anything amiss. Infant features changed quickly, and in 1931, identification relied on handwritten tags tied around tiny ankles. Tags which were easy to misplace or rewrite if someone knew the system intimately. Neither mother suspected anything. Margaret Lanning was preoccupied with her own recovery, exhausted and grateful that her child cried with reassuring strength. To Doyle baby really, the Lanning heir was smaller, quieter, but Anna attributed it to her difficult labor and her own frail condition. She had no husband to lean on, no medical education, and no reason to suspect that someone in a white uniform might alter the course of her child's life. Within days, the Lannings returned to their elegant home on Elmwood Heights, greeted by servants and political associates bearing gifts. Newspapers printed brief announcements celebrating the birth of Brackford's newest golden boy. Meanwhile, Anna walked home alone through the slush-covered streets, carrying her infant wrapped in a second-hand blanket sewn by her late husband's mother. No one wrote about her child. No reporters knocked on her door. Years But the switch remained buried in the quietness of routine life. The wealthy boy raised as a Doyle, worked odd jobs after school, and grew up in a house where meals were simple and money was scarce. The Lanning household raised the other boy among tutors, chauffeurs, and expectations of political legacy. The difference in opportunities was stark, but the echoes of their true origins lingered in subtle ways. A mismatch of temperaments, unexplained resemblances to families they did not belong to, and quiet moments when each mother wondered privately why her child didn't seem to fully mirror her or her late husband. It was not until 1949, when the Doyle boy, biologically the Lanning heir, submitted his enlistment paperwork to the U.S. Army, that inconsistencies in his blood type raised questions. The officer handling his medical records suspected clerical error and contacted Brackford Hospital for verification. One request led to another. Dusty archives were unearthed, and the Lanning family physician, curious and increasingly uneasy, reopened the maternity records from 1931. Old names resurfaced. Old signatures were examined, and one name appeared more often than any other in the sequence of midnight duties. Nurse Evelyn Harrow. When investigators arrived at her small retirement cottage on the outskirts of town, she was found sitting at her kitchen table, stirring sugar into her tea, as though she had long expected them. Her hair was thinner, her back slightly curved, but her eyes carried the same steady calm she had known throughout her career. She listened without interruption as they explained the inconsistencies, the blood results, and the likelihood of an illegal infant substitution. Her hands trembled only once. Then she placed the spoon down, folded her fingers over one another, and began to speak. Outside, a weak sun was pressing through gray clouds, the scent of cold metal and damp leaves drifting in from the cracked entrance door. Inside, 20 young men, barely adults but eager to prove themselves, stood in line with stiff paper forms in their hands, shifting their weight anxiously from one boot to another. Among them was Henry Dalton, the boy who for 18 years had never questioned the name he carried. The first flags went up when the enlistment physician, Dr. Walter Renfield, reviewed Henry's blood test results. Blood typing was not new. It had been standard procedure since the war, but its use in verifying parentage had only recently entered public consciousness. And yet, when Renfield compared the boy's blood type with the parental information on file, he frowned, then frowned deeper. Finally, he raised his head and asked Henry, with a softened voice, whether both his parents were still living. Henry answered yes. His father, he said, was the Dalton man everyone in the county knew, Thomas Dalton, owner of Dalton Steelworks, second largest employer in the region after the coal mines. Henry spoke the name the way townspeople said the names of distant kings. His mother, he added, was Margaret Dalton, who was known locally for funding the yearly church charity drives and for insisting on personally packing bread baskets for the widows of miners. Dr. Renfield reconsidered the files twice before discreetly requesting supervisor verification. Protocol demanded it. Something wasn't aligning, and though the doctor could not yet place the source of the discrepancy, it drifted in the air like a faint, sour sentence scene, yet unmistakable. Henry noticed the tension the way any perceptive 18-year-old might notice something off. A hushed whisper, a shared look between two adults, a folder slipping out of someone's grip. But like most boys raised to obey rather than question, he remained silent until asked otherwise. The formal inquiry began the next morning. Henry was asked to return to the office accompanied by a parent or guardian. When Mr. Dalton arrived, the air in the room seemed to shift. Dalton was not a towering figure, but his presence filled space with an unmistakable authority forged in boardrooms, factory floors, and town hall meetings. He was not accustomed to being summoned. He was accustomed to summoning others. Yet here he stood, coat unbuttoned, jaw tense, waiting while the doctor spread the papers on the table. The explanation was brief, clinical, and entirely without sentiment. Henry's blood type made it genetically impossible for him to be the biological son of Thomas and Margaret Dalton. The silence that followed was heavy long enough for the clock on the wall to tick through several seconds. At first, Mr. Dalton dismissed the test as clerical error. He demanded retesting, called the physician incompetent, questioned the equipment, and insisted that a man of his standing would not be subjected to baseless insinuations. But even as he spoke, a faint tremor of uncertainty crossed his features. In another corner of the county, a different domestic scene unfolded that same evening. In a worn-down cottage on Minesfur lived Elena Nell Witherwood-Sinse, 1931, the year the mines collapsed, taking her husband along with 12 others. She had raised her son, Samuel Hartwell, in that little house built of shale stones and patch planks, its windows warped from decades of harsh winters. He had never been in trouble, never caused his mother a moment of grief. He was the sort of boy who returned borrowed wrenches, cleaned and oiled, who mended boots without being asked, who walked his mother to church every Sunday morning. And yet, when the same blood test that uncovered Henry's mystery was processed for Sam's enlistment, the sergeant, reviewing it, paused. Sam Hartwell's blood type did not match the records of his deceased father or, more importantly, the medical file from his birth register. The enlistment office did not initially connect the two anomalies. They were recorded separately, logged as clerical inconsistencies to be resolved at a later date. But small towns are vessels for rumors, and secrets do not stay in drawers for long when filing clerks gossip over coffee, or when officers share uneasy stories during smoke breaks. Within a week, whispers had spread across both sides of the county. Something was wrong with the Dalton boy, and something else was wrong with the Hartwell boy. It was the county clerk, Mrs. Ophelia Marija, woman known for her meticulous record-keeping and her inability to tolerate loose ends, who was the first to propose that the two cases might be linked. She retrieved birth logs from St. Catherine's maternity home, records yellowed at the edges, but still legible. The pages from May 1931, the month both boys had been born, appeared to be in order at first glance. Names, birth weights, delivery times, attending physicians, and midwife signatures were all present. Yet something about the handwriting in one particular row bothered her. The loop of a letter, the slant of a pen, stroke details too subtle for most eyes, but glaring to those trained to notice irregular. 2 lines, side by side on the register, had been altered. Not boldly, not carelessly, but altered. The ink was slightly darker in places where it should have been uniform. The pressure of the pen differed between columns. Someone had rewritten numbers, minute changes, but enough to raise suspicion in the mind of the meticulous. Mrs. Merritt made copies of the pages and brought them to the office of Sheriff Lionel Grayson. Sheriff Grayson was a man carved by the Great Depression and hardened by 2 decades of overseeing disputes among miners, steelworkers, and factory foremen. He trusted facts over emotions, paperwork over rumors, and believed that the truth of any matter could be traced like coal dust on a miner's boot tiff. One only knew where to look. When Mrs. Marriage laid the documents on his desk, he studied them in silence, pipe in hand, eyes narrowing beneath bushy brows. "I'll need the original logs," he finally said. "You'll have them," she answered. "And," he added, "I'd like to see the maternity staff list from that year." That was the moment the name surfaced for the first time in 18 years. Nurse Clara Whitford. Her personnel file had been archived in the basement of the county building, its folders slightly warped from age. In it were glowing evaluations, letters of gratitude from mothers, photographs of Clara in crisp white uniform beside bassinets, lined with lace. She had begun her career in 1925, quickly rising to senior maternity nurse by 1929. Supervisors described her as diligent, gentle, and exceptionally gifted at calming distressed infants. Yet the same file also contained her resignation letter from 1933, whose 2 years after the births in question, with no explanation other than personal circumstances, Sheriff Grayson requested her current address and learned that she lived on the outskirts of town, in a modest cottage near the edge of a birchwood grove. She was 71 now, long retired, rarely seen in public except on Sundays when she walked to St. Luke's Church with a cane decorated by a brass bird at its handle. By all accounts, she was quiet, polite, and harmless. But the sheriff knew that harmless people sometimes carried the heaviest secrets. Before he approached her, he assembled the timeline, with the enlistment anomalies, the altered logs, and the peculiar coincidence of 2 boys born mere minutes apart. The picture that emerged was troubling and fragile. A misstep could stir the entire county into chaos, especially considering the Dalton family's political influence. Grayson contacted the county attorney and arranged for a discreet interview. They agreed that no charges could be pursued without concrete evidence, and, above all, the matter had to remain confidential until the facts were confirmed. 2 days later, Grayson and Deputy Roland Price arrived at Clara Whitford's front door. It was early afternoon, the sort of pale autumn day when sunlight looks thin and brittle. Clara answered the knock herself. Her hair, once chestnut, was now white and neatly pinned. Her posture was bent, her voice soft but steady. "Yes, Sheriff?" she asked, as though she had expected him. "We need to ask you a few questions regarding records from St. Catherine's maternity home," he said. Clara's expression did not change. She simply stepped aside to let them in. Her cottage smelled faintly of lavender and old books. On a small table by the window lay a knitting basket, an unfinished blanket draped across the arm of a chair. Grayson noted the calmness with which she moved, not the confidence of innocence. Something else, something closer to resignation. The sheriff began with neutral questions. Staffing numbers, delivery procedures, how logs were kept in those years. Clara answered with clarity, sharp memory intact despite her age. She spoke fondly of mothers she attended to, of Christmas shifts lit by fairy lamps, of nights when storms cut power and nurses worked by kerosene lantern. But when Grayson mentioned the Dalton and Hartwell births, Clara's knitting needles slipped from her grasp and clattered on the floor. Only then did she show the first sign of fracture. She inhaled slowly, her chest rising beneath her wool cardigan. Her eyes, gray and soft as fog, drifted toward the window as though she were watching something unfold beyond the birch trees. "That was a long time ago," she murmured. "We know," Grayson said, "but the records show inconsistencies. We need to understand what happened." Clara folded her hands in her lap, her spine straightened slightly, as if prepared for a confession long rehearsed. "What do you want to know?" she asked. "Did you alter the birth logs?" Silence. It stretched for so long that the ticking of Clara's mantel clock became the only sound. Finally, she nodded once. "Yes." Grayson exchanged a glance with Deputy Price. They did not interrupt. Clara's voice grew faint, almost like the whisper of fabric being folded. "I did it for mercy," she said. "At least I thought I did." She explained how, in May 19, 2 deliveries occurred within minutes of each other. One in the hospital est, private suite, reserved for the wealthy. The other in the charity ward reserved for the poor. The Dalton baby, according to Clara, was born with complications, barely breathing, with a weak pulse and shallow respiration. The Hartwell infant, by contrast, entered the world strong and crying. Clara paused. Her hands trembled faintly. "The Daltons were desperate," she said. "They had lost 2 infants before. Mrs. Dalton was frail, the strain so terrible that the doctors feared another loss might break her. When their newborn failed to take his first proper breath, the mother's screams, she swallowed. I thought she would die." Grayson did not speak. He simply let the confession spill, slow and inevitable. Clara described how she had stepped away from the private suite and walked into the charity ward, where young Eleanor Hartwell lay exhausted but joyful, unaware of what was to come. Clara claimed she had acted alone. No doctors, no midwives, no accomplices. She insisted that she had believed she was saving one family from devastation while giving the other child a chance at a better life. But what she never anticipated was that both children would grow into young men who would unknowingly carry one another's fates. When she finished, Clara pressed a handkerchief to her lips. Deputy Price's jaw clenched, though he remained silent. Grayson understood the impulse. In those years, swapping infants was a crime of enormous gravity: fraud, falsification of medical records, and, more profoundly, a moral betrayal that could shatter lives. Yet Clara was elderly now, frail, and living her final years in quiet repentance. "What do you want us to do with this information?" she asked softly. "We need the truth," Grayson replied. "All of it." Clara looked toward the birchwood again. "You have it." The sheriff and deputy left soon after, but the confession followed them like a phantom. The next steps were clear. They needed to notify both families, file official reports, and prepare for the consequences, legal, social, emotional, that would inevitably erupt once the story became public. Yet Grayson felt something deeper than duty. He felt the weight of history turning in his hands, as though he had lifted a stone that had kept secrets buried for nearly 2 decades. When he returned to his office, he opened a fresh folder and wrote at the top in bold ink, "Lost Cradle case. Master file." And so the investigation officially began, not with a scream or a scandal, but with quiet handwriting on a county sheriff's desk on a gray autumn evening in 19... For most of the town's residents, the following 18 years passed like any others, with the predictable hum of factory whistles breaking the dawn, the slow-moving freight trains dragging their weight across the river bridges, the rhythm of workers returning to their narrow row houses with the day suit on their jackets, and the ever-present haze of coal dust settling over Pennsylvania like a second, dull winter. But beneath that familiar monotony, 2 families lived lives that, unbeknownst to them, had been fundamentally altered before they even began. These families, their Carlyles, and the Whitcombs, moved through the decades believing in the shaped truth laid before them, unaware that their private histories were bound together by a single decision made inside the dim, fluorescent light of the maternity ward in 1931. The Carlyle boy, raised as the rightful heir to his father's industrial influence, grew up within the strict order of a household that valued discipline above affection. Their home was large compared to most, though built in the same practical brick style found throughout the county. It held the mark of wealthy restraint rather than luxury. Dark wooden banisters polished by generations of hands, heavy curtains chosen more for utility than charm, and a dining room cabinet filled with inherited china that was rarely used but never forgotten. The boy learned early that duty shaped identity. His education was rigorous, overseen by private tutors who maintained schedules more unforgiving than those of the steel mills. His meals were eaten in silence except on Sundays, when his father lectured him on business ethics, local politics, and what it meant to be a Carlyle in a town where the family name carried the weight of economic survival for hundreds of workers. Everything about his upbringing pressed towards the assumption that he was destined for leadership, as though the role was etched into his bones rather than taught into him. Meanwhile, across town, in a modest single-story house near the mines, the Whitcomb boy grew in circumstances that could not have contrasted more sharply. His childhood was shaped not by expectation but by resilience. The air inside his home always carried a faint smell of soap mixed with lingering coal dust. His mother could never quite scrub out of the floorboards. Money was scarce, and his mother worked tirelessly, first as a laundress for miners' families, later cleaning offices downtown when the laundries closed during the downturn. The boy learned frugality, ingenuity, and the unspoken understanding that every small comfort came at a cost someone had worked themselves weary to earn. Unlike the Carlyle household, silence there was rare. Their home vibrated with the noise of neighbors visiting, radios humming unevenly through the static, and the constant bustle of making ends meet. Yet, despite the strain, warmth existed there, a lived-in, imperfect warmth built from shared struggles rather than wealth. The meditative passing of years deepened the distance between the 2 young men who should have shared the same cradle. One became disciplined, inward, and accustomed to a world that treated him with deference. The other became intuitive, outward-looking, and shaped by the need to navigate life with quick instincts and unwavering will. In these differences, the legacy of the nurse's decision quietly flourished. It had grown roots in the foundation of their personalities long before anyone suspected the truth. Still, the years carried them forward in parallel, unaware of each other's existence beyond the invisible thread connecting their origins. As the town aged, so did its institutions. The maternity ward where the fateful switch had taken place was slowly phased out and eventually repurposed as a small administrative annex for the hospital. The records stored inside IT paper files, bound with aging twine, medical logs with fading ink, and birth certificates typed on yellowing sheets remained largely untouched. Those documents sat inside steel cabinets, collecting dust in the quiet hum of forgotten corners. To the townspeople, they held no intrigue. To the staff, they were inconvenient relics kept only because bureaucracy demanded they exist. To the nurse who had orchestrated the switch, however, they were the last remaining evidence of her private burden. Through the decades, she carried that burden like a shadow crossing the years with her. As she aged, moving from maternity work to clerical duties, and finally to retirement, she found that the memory of her decision did not fade, but rather tightened its hold as the world around her changed. Her hands grew weak, her eyesight dimmed, and her steps slowed. Yet the events of that night in 1931 remained in vivid detail. She could still see the identical blue blankets, the flicker of the overhead lights, the smell of antiseptic. She could still feel the weight of each infant as she lifted them. One sleepy, the other small and frail. Their futures shifting with a single turn of her body. The moral justification she had once used that the widow's child deserved a chance at better life had not aged well. The years had eroded its certainty, leaving only the abrasive honesty that she had stolen a destiny from both families. Throughout the 18 years, the town remained locked in the same slow rhythm, and the two boys matured into young men shaped by their distinct environments. The Carlisle boy entered prep programs, attended social events with other wealthy families, and eventually made plans to apply for officer training. His father expected nothing less than excellence. His mother quietly hoped he would one day soften the rigidity that defined him. The Whitcomb boy, on the other hand, spent his teenage years balancing odd jobs, stacking crates at the general store, sweeping the church steps, hauling supplies for the railroad depot during the summer. His life was an accumulation of real-world lessons, learned through necessity rather than privilege. He admired his mother for her perseverance, yet he carried an ache he could not name, as though something essential inside him was slightly misaligned without his understanding why. The town itself remained largely indifferent to the more personal dynamics shaping the young men's lives. For industrial towns of that era rarely paused to consider individual narratives. Work demanded too much energy, and survival left little room for pondering the deeper mysteries of fate. Still, minor stories circulated within the community, rumors of the Carlisle boys' strict upbringing, admiration for the Whitcomb boys' resourcefulness, the nurse's declining health, yet none contained the slightest suspicion that a shared truth bound these individuals together. The nurse, who had once been an unremarkable figure in the hospital, grew into something of a reclusive local curiosity in her later years as she retreated from public life, though her avoidance of attention never raised alarms. People simply assumed that age had made her weary, not knowing that she spent many nights awake, tortured by the fear that the past would eventually reveal itself. It was during the quieter mid-1940s, when national attention was focused on broader conflicts and wartime rationing, that the first subtle signs of trouble began to form. The Carlisle boys' medical evaluations, which were required for certain officer training programs, began to show small irregularities, nothing alarming, but unusual enough that military physicians requested additional testing. The young man found it irritating rather than concerning, and his parents treated the news with their typical measured calm. However, those tests, conducted with the rigor demanded by government standards, became the unintentional prelude to the truth. The results were not consistent with his documented blood type, which created a discrepancy that puzzled both the military officials and the Carlisle family physicians. Meanwhile, the Whitcomb boy lived his life with the grounded practicality that had guided him since childhood. His mother's health declined, pushing him to increase his work hours, and he accepted the mounting responsibilities without protests. His family had no connections to official institutions beyond the town's basic systems, and he had no reason to suspect that somewhere in the neatly organized filing drawers of the local hospital annex, an old, nearly forgotten ledger contained the first written clue to his true identity. Though the two young men did not cross paths, their lives were gradually steering toward a collision shaped not by chance, but by the inevitable consequence of records that had not yet been destroyed. The nurse, aging and frail, sensed this shift even if she did not witness its specific details. Whenever she heard distant mentions of the Carlisle family at the general store or read snippets of their name in the local paper, she felt her stomach twist with anxiety. At times, she considered confessing her act, but each attempt dissolved into fear of public humiliation, fear of legal repercussions, fear of the devastation her admission would cause. So she remained silent, trapped in a moral paralysis that deepened with every passing year. The town's residents carried on, unaware that the quiet, almost undetectable ripples of the nurse's decision were expanding outward, preparing to break the surface. The foundations of two families, once set in stone, were preparing to shift in ways neither could have anticipated. And as the 18th year approached the legal threshold of adulthood, the structures of identity, fate, and truth were lined up like brittle supports, ready to crumble at the slightest touch from bureaucracy, science, or conscience. In that sense, the calm of the 1940s was deceptive. It was not peace, but the long inhale before the revelation. The moment when the weight of nearly 2 decades of silence pressed down with increasing insistence on the fragile boundary between secrecy and discovery. By the time the year of reckoning arrived, the town had unknowingly positioned itself for a scandal that would echo through its industrial streets and small businesses. The past, after stretching itself thin across 18 quiet years, was preparing to snap back with the precision of truth long withheld. The nurse, the families, and the 2 boys now on the cusp of manhood were standing at the edge of a story that would soon pull them all into a public reckoning. And the town, with its mills, its smoke, its routines, and its oblivious citizens, was about to learn that even the smallest actions in the privacy of a maternity ward can reshape the destinies of entire families and become the kind of controversy remembered for generations. The small industrial city, accustomed to the predictable rhythms of factory sirens, coal trains, and Sunday church bells, now pulsed with an undercurrent of speculation and unease. Newspapers published cautious columns referring to the matter as the cradle confusion, though among locals the story had already acquired sharper, less forgiving names, whispered in barbershops, mill yards, and on the porches of narrow row houses where people sat in the evenings with their arms crossed, listening for news carried on the wind like coal soot. The investigators, both state and local, continued to unravel the medical records that had survived the hospital's previous decades of poor storage, neglect, and several episodes of near flooding in the basement archive room. The yellowing pages often softened or warped at the edges required careful handling. Some sheets were so fragile that the slightest shift produced a fine dust of paper fibers that drifted into the air, like remnants of a bygone era disintegrating before their eyes. Still, the handwriting remained legible enough. Names scribbled in rushed cursive, cryptic notes, typical for overworked staff, and timestamps that reflected the relentless pace of childbirth in a working-class region where families were large and pregnancies frequent. Amid these artifacts were the birth ledgers from January 1931, where 2 entries previously unremarkable now stood out with a kind of terrible clarity, like faint fingerprints revealed under a forensic lamp. Meanwhile, the families involved found themselves adrift in emotional terrain few could navigate with dignity or calm. The widow of the miner, long accustomed to a life shaped by hardship, found her memories probed by officials determined to reconstruct the circumstances that might explain how her child could have been switched. She had spent 18 years believing her son carried the features, temperament, and burdens of her late husband. Now, every recollection, every photo, every small gesture of the boy seemed cast in a surreal light. The affluent family, meanwhile, recoiled from the idea that the child they had raised with every resource at their disposal might not be theirs by blood. Their world had been built on certainty, structure, and lineage concepts that now felt suddenly porous. The truth was less dramatic. She was an elderly woman who had lived through wars, epidemics, and the collapse of industries, and whose memory operated in inconsistent bursts of clarity and fog. Some days, she could recall the exact pattern of the hospital's tile floor, the scent of disinfectant, the weight of a newborn placed into her arms. Other days, she struggled to distinguish one year from another. Her modest apartment filled with lace curtains, old photographs, and meticulously folded linens emitted the aura of a life lived quietly. Yet beneath that calm was the gnawing awareness that her past actions, or accidental, were now being reinterpreted by strangers armed with modern forensic understanding and a vocabulary she never anticipated needing to defend herself against. As the investigation deepened, Another set of records emerged to maternal logs from the prenatal clinic revealing patterns of staff shortages, overcrowding, and administrative chaos during the winter months of 1931. Several nurses had been reassigned temporarily due to an influenza outbreak, leaving a skeleton crew to manage a surge of births during an especially brutal cold spell. These contextual details complicated the narrative. What at first seemed like a deliberate act by a single individual now appeared potentially woven into a tapestry of systemic errors, exhaustion, and the relentless pace of a hospital stretched beyond capacity. Researchers and historians were brought in to contextualize the conditions of early 20th century maternity wards, emphasizing how isolated misidentifications could occur in an age before modern labeling protocols, electronic tracking, or standardized wristbands. Still, there remained the looming question of intention. If the nurse had indeed knowingly switched the infants, the motive remained murky. Whispers circulated about compassion, resentment, misguided loyalty, or a moment of panic under pressure. Some speculated she had attempted to give the miner's widow a child with better prospects, believing, however, paternalistically that wealth could shield a baby from the suffering she had seen in coal families. Others suggested the opposite, that she sought to protect the vulnerable newborn of the poorer woman from being raised in an environment of unattainable expectations, fearing that money could not provide the tenderness she had seen lacking in more affluent households. The nurse herself offered no definitive reasoning, only fragmented memories that seemed to dissolve under scrutiny, leaving investigators perpetually unsatisfied. Amid this swirl of uncertainty, the young men at the center of the case raised, as members of families not their own, underwent a quiet and painful transformation under the public eye. The one who had discovered the truth while attempting to enlist found himself scrutinized by neighbors, friends, and strangers who struggled to reconcile the boy they claimed to know with the new reality emerging in newspaper columns. He carried himself with a reserved solemnity in those weeks, avoiding crowds and declining invitations, attempting to process the revelation that his life story had been assembled from an error he never had a chance to witness or prevent. His counterpart, raised in the widow's modest household, faced a different sort of turmoil. The fear of displacement, the dread that his identity might be stripped away, and the realization that the father he had mourned throughout childhood had no biological connection to him. Both youths remained objects of fascination for the community, though neither desired the attention. Each retreated into private spaces, trying to preserve some shred of normalcy while their histories were picked apart like archaeological fragments. The town's social institutions struggled to maintain order amid the rising tension. Churches delivered sermons about forgiveness, fate, and the mysteries of divine will, though some congregants left more confused than comforted. Schools implemented new guidelines to keep gossip from disrupting classrooms, though such efforts failed as students whispered speculations in hallways, captivated by the idea of lives swapped at birth. Local businesses displayed a mixture of sympathy and opportunism. Bar owners enjoyed the surge in patrons, eager to discuss the latest developments, while shopkeepers observed rising demand for the evening editions of newspapers covering the case. It seemed the entire community was suspended in a state of collective introspection, as though the cradle switch case had become a mirror reflecting their anxieties about class, destiny, and the fragility of family bonds. Public pressure intensified when the State Bureau requested physical examinations and blood tests for both young men and their parents. Although the science behind these tests was rudimentary by modern standards, they offered a degree of clarity that the muddled memories and brittle documents could not. When the results confirmed the mismatch that the recruitment office had initially suspected, the findings were delivered in sealed envelopes, handed over in subdued ceremonies, witnessed only by a handful of officials and family members. These moments, though conducted with discretion, quickly leaked into the town's rumor mill, reinforcing what many had already accepted as truth. The ironclad confirmation finally pushed the investigation toward its closing phase, though the emotional consequences were only beginning to unfold. Yet, even as the scientific evidence solidified, the legal implications remained thorny and without precedent. The statute of limitations for medical misconduct had long expired, and the hospital where the switch occurred had undergone multiple administrative restructurings that obscured accountability. Debates emerged among legal scholars about whether intent, negligence, or the broader socioeconomic context should influence the outcome. Their homes, once filled with predictable routines, became places of tense reflection, where every family photograph took on new meaning. The parents of the affluent household examined old baby pictures with an almost forensic intensity, searching for features they had previously overlooked, wondering whether the resemblance they once proudly pointed out to visitors had been imagined all along. The widow, meanwhile, sat for long periods in silence, clutching mementos from her son's infancy, trying to reconcile the tenderness she felt for the child she raised with the grief of realizing he was not the baby she had delivered on that freezing January night. It was a grief without a clear target, a kind of sorrow that hovered in the air like dust unsettling, inescapable, and impossible to sweep away. As the preliminary findings were drafted, rumors circulated that the final report would not only expose the details of the switch, but also offer an assessment of the hospital's practices during the 1931 winter. Some feared the revelations would tarnish the town's historical reputation, overshadowing decades of achievements and community efforts. Others argued that confronting the past was necessary to preserve the integrity of future medical institutions. The debate, though earnest, carried a sense of futility. No matter how the case was framed, its emotional impact had already seeped into the fabric of the town, becoming a permanent chapter in its unofficial history. By the time investigators prepared to present their comprehensive findings, the town had entered a state of restrained anticipation. People walked the streets with an unspoken awareness that whatever conclusions emerged would not resolve the deeper moral and emotional dilemmas the case had unearthed. In the final months leading up to the official inquiry, the town of Millhaven found itself suspended between two eras. The quiet provincial stability it once relied upon, and the heavy, irreversible weight of a scandal that had reshaped every family involved. What had begun as a single discrepancy in an enlistment blood test had unraveled into one of the most contentious medical ethics cases of the decade, and by the time investigators compiled their last summaries, Millhaven's reputation had traveled far beyond Pennsylvania. Newspapers from Philadelphia, Boston, and even Chicago had sent correspondents who shadowed the proceedings, filling hotel rooms and diner booths with men and women carrying notebooks, typewriters, and the peculiar hunger of those who sensed a headline that would travel the nation. By now, the town no longer tried to resist the intrusion. It had surrendered itself to being observed, questioned, and dissected, its quiet streets forever altered by the attention. The two families at the center of the case had lived through the 18 years preceding the revelation in sharply different conditions. But now they both felt equally displaced, as if the boundaries of their private histories had been torn open and left exposed to the world. The Wycliffe household, once marked by political ambition and carefully cultivated decorum, had retreated behind drawn curtains and minimal public appearances their prior confidence, replaced by a subdued, almost brittle manner that revealed how profoundly the revelation had shaken their sense of lineage and identity. Every newspaper photograph taken of the Wycliffe father in those days bore the same tense expression, his posture stiff and defensive, as if he were bracing against an invisible storm. His wife, though less present in the public eye, suffered the burden in quieter, more enduring ways, withdrawing from committees and charity functions that had once formed the core of her social life. Their biological son, raised unknowingly by the family of the widowed miner, faced the sudden burden of expectation from a man whose household he had never lived in, learning that he was, by blood, part of a family deeply invested in legacy and status, though the emotional foundation that might have supported such claims had never been formed. On the other side of town, the Carver family, built on the modest earnings and quiet resilience of a woman who had spent nearly 2 decades believing herself the mother of a child who was not hers, struggled to redefine the life that had always felt unquestionably real. Their home, once filled with the modest comforts earned through consistent work and sacrifice, now felt to them strangely fragile, as if every piece of furniture and every framed photograph belonged to a reality that had been proven counterfeit. The young man who had grown up among them found himself pulled into a liminal space, caught between affection for the family who had raised him and an uncertain curiosity regarding the strangers who shared his blood. Although he retained his characteristic restraint and steadiness, the internal conflict showed itself in subtle ways, the length of pauses before he answered questions, the quiet hours he spent alone, and the distant contemplative manner that emerged whenever his circumstances were discussed. The convergence of these emotional landscapes formed the backdrop against which the final inquiry unfolded. The investigators dedicated their concluding efforts to reconstructing not only the events of the day the infants had been exchanged, but also the intent and motivations of the aging nurse whose testimony had become the central pillar upon which the entire narrative depended. Baptiste's own demeanor had changed, notably since the early days of questioning, whether from exhaustion, resignation, or the slow erosion of secrecy. She carried herself with an air of solemn inevitability, as though she had accepted that the events she had attempted to bury beneath years of routine had resurfaced with a force she could no longer resist. The inquiry board, aware of the significance of her statements, conducted its final interviews with meticulous care, ensuring that her recounting aligned with the hospital records, the testimonies of former staff, and the surviving notes from the maternity ward. Or by some private moral philosophy that took shape only in her own mind, the decision had been hers alone. The board, though careful to maintain impartiality, noted the absence of any corroborating testimony that might explain the full psychological context in which she had acted, leaving future historians to speculate regarding the deeper motivations behind the act. In the final report prepared for the State Medical Bureau, the case was described as a grave breach of ethical duty, exacerbated by the intentional concealment of infant identity, resulting in 18 years of familial displacement. Yet the document acknowledged the limitations of punitive measures. Given the nurse's advanced age and deteriorating health, the board refrained from recommending imprisonment or significant legal action, citing the improbability of her surviving prolonged proceedings. Instead, they recommended the revocation of her license, a symbolic gesture more than a practical consequence, as she had long since retired. This decision was met with quiet approval by some members of the town, stirred resentment among others, who believed that the gravity of the act warranted a more substantial reckoning. Local editorials oscillated between condemnation and pity, reflecting the divided moral climate of the community. With the inquiry formally closed, the matter shifted from the jurisdiction of officials to the hands of the families themselves, who now had to navigate the far more complicated terrain of identity, belonging, and emotional restitution. Though the state offered to facilitate counseling and mediation, the cultural landscape of the late 1930s provided few models for addressing such circumstances. Most families of the era relied on internal discretion and private conversations rather than public or therapeutic intervention. As a result, the Wycliffes and the Cavas approached the future with an unspoken understanding that no official decree could repair what had been disrupted. The work of reconciliation would unfold over years, perhaps decades, shaped by the personal inclinations of the young men whose lives had been redirected. In the months that followed, some tentative steps were taken. The young man raised by the Carvers visited the Wycliffe estate on several occasions, though each visit carried a palpable tension, for he entered the home as a biological heir, but not as a son in any emotional sense. He studied the furnishings, the formal photographs, and the polished wood surfaces with a quiet curiosity that betrayed both interest and detachment. Meanwhile, the Wycliffe son, introduced to the Carver household, approached the unfamiliar environment with caution. Having been raised in privilege, the modest surroundings felt foreign, yet he displayed a certain sincerity in his attempts to understand the life he might have lived had circumstances been different. Despite these reciprocal efforts, neither young man appeared entirely certain of what connection he sought or whether any meaningful integration of identities was possible. Yet within the town, the memory of the case remained fresh and raw, etched into the collective consciousness in a way that would persist for generations. Local historians archived newspaper clippings and inquiry reports, aware that the case would be studied for its ethical implications long after the immediate participants had faded from public memory. For the families, the story was far from concluded. Their lives had been irrevocably intertwined by a moment of misguided intervention, and the path forward would demand patience, introspection, and a willingness to confront truths that could not be undone. The aging nurse, whose single act had altered the trajectory of multiple lives, spent her remaining days in relative solitude, though she received occasional letters, some condemning, Others pleading for explanations she could not provide, she withdrew from public engagement. Her neighbors noted that she became increasingly frail, her steps slow and deliberate, her gaze distant. Whether she felt remorse or maintained her earlier belief in the justification of her actions remained a mystery. The inquiry report hinted at traces of remorse in her later testimony, though these impressions were speculative at best, the product of investigators interpreting the subdued tone of an elderly woman confronting the consequences of a long-buried decision. As the decade neared its close, Millhaven settled into a new equilibrium, carrying forward the shadow of the case as part of its local folklore. Yet the deeper resonance of the incident lay in its quiet demonstration of how a single act, concealed for nearly 2 decades, could reshape the destinies of individuals, families, and entire communities. The investigation had ended, the reporters had departed, and the official documents had been filed away. But the emotional echoes endured. The dissonance between blood and upbringing, the tension between privilege and hardship, and the fragile nature of trust in institutions all remained unresolved, continuing to influence the decisions and reflections of those affected.